There are moments in stories like this where everything people thought they understood suddenly starts shifting beneath them. Not because new rumors appear. Rumors have surrounded the Whittaker family for years. Not because another creator uploads another reaction video. The internet has already produced thousands of opinions about this family, about Eric Carroll, about Patrick, about Betty, about Larry, about who helped, who exploited, who lied, who cared, and who benefited. No. What changes a story is when somebody who stayed silent for a very long time finally decide to explain what they say was happening behind the scenes the entire time. And according to Eric Carroll, the public only saw fragments. That is the part of this story that keeps resurfacing over and over again. The idea that viewers were watching isolated moments without understanding the pressure building underneath them. Because from the outside, people saw YouTube videos, live streams, fundraising arguments, accusations, emotional confrontations, and eventually complete collapse. But Eric says that underneath all of it was something far more unstable than the internet realized. A vulnerable family. A house filled with tension. Conflicts nobody online fully understood. And a situation that, according to him, became dangerous long before the public realized it. The strange thing is that when people talk about the Whittaker story now, most conversations begin at the collapse. The investigations, the state involvement, the separation of family members, the accusations about money, the internet wars between creators. But Eric says the real story started much earlier, long before APS, long before protective orders, long before accusations flooded social media. According to Eric, the warning signs were already there the moment he began spending real time around the family. Not online, not through edited clips, in person. He says there were things viewers could never fully understand through a camera. Small details that looked insignificant individually, but together painted a picture of a household operating under constant instability. Hygiene struggles, confusion, fear, emotional dependency, isolation from the outside world, medical neglect concerns. People who had lived almost entirely inside one routine for decades suddenly being exposed to massive public attention. And Eric says one of the biggest mistakes people made was assuming the family understood the internet the same way outsiders did. He argues they did not. To the audience, YouTube was entertainment, content, drama, commentary. To the family, according to Eric, it became something much more confusing. A flood of strangers entering their lives. Attention arriving faster than comprehension. People bringing gifts, cameras, promises, offers, arguments, rumors, expectations. Imagine living most of your life isolated in rural West Virginia and suddenly becoming recognizable to millions of people online. That kind of exposure changes a family whether they are prepared for it or not. And Eric says they were not prepared at all. One of the most important things Eric keeps emphasizing is that viewers misunderstood the level of vulnerability inside that house. He says people online often treated the Whittakers like characters instead of human beings with very real limitations, fears, and dependencies. He talks about how quickly simple routines became emotionally significant. Teaching someone to use deodorant consistently. Teaching hand-washing habits. Teaching basic hygiene structure. Helping organize appointments. Explaining money. Explaining schedules. Explaining why strangers online were suddenly talking about them. To many viewers, those things sounded small. But Eric says they revealed something deeper. He believes the family had gone years without consistent support systems around them. And that realization disturbed him. Because according to Eric, local systems already knew the family existed. That is one of the biggest themes in his version of the story. He repeatedly questions how so many agencies, programs, and institutions allegedly knew about the Whittakers for years while so little meaningful intervention ever occurred. He describes meetings where officials discussed resources available to the family: cleaning assistance, hygiene support, social activities, transportation help, medical coordination, daily care services. And Eric's reaction was immediate. If all of these resources existed, why had they not already been implemented years earlier? That question became one of the emotional turning points for him, because the more he learned, the more he began feeling like the Whittakers had spent years existing inside a system that mostly observed them instead of helping them. And according to Eric, that realization changed how he approached everything afterward. At first, he says he thought he was helping a struggling family stabilize their lives. But gradually, he started believing he had stepped into something much more complicated. Because inside the family itself, there were fractures, tensions, conflicting loyalties, manipulation, fear. And according to Eric, one person sat at the center of much of that instability: BJ. The internet already knows the broad outlines of that conflict. But Eric says the public still does not fully understand how quickly the atmosphere around the house changed once those tensions escalated. At first, he says, he tried giving everyone the benefit of the doubt. Larry appeared sincere. Betty seemed overwhelmed but caring. The household felt chaotic but manageable. Then came the gas can incident, a detail that sounds almost absurdly small until you understand why Eric believes it mattered so much. Patrick allegedly discovered Larry taking gas from his property while Patrick was recovering from a broken leg. When confronted, according to Eric, Larry admitted taking it but claimed he was pressured into doing so. And that moment changed everything. Because Eric says that was the first time he realized fear inside the house might be controlling people's behavior. The gas itself did not matter. What mattered was the explanation. According to Eric's account, Larry allegedly claimed BJ threatened him. And suddenly the story stopped looking like ordinary family dysfunction. Now Eric believed pressure, intimidation, and dependency were shaping decisions inside the home. Then came the issue of the house phone. To outsiders, that detail sounds almost trivial. But Eric says it terrified him. The family allegedly depended heavily on the house phone because cell service in the area was unreliable. Several family members reportedly had serious health problems, heart conditions, medical vulnerabilities, emergency risks. And according to Eric, there were times when access to that phone allegedly became part of the conflict itself. That was the moment, Eric says, when he stopped viewing the situation as internet content entirely. Now he believed safety was involved. Now he believed vulnerable adults might genuinely be at risk. And once he reached that conclusion, everything accelerated. Court visits, protective orders, law enforcement, APS involvement, multiple trips between Georgia and West Virginia, attempts to stabilize finances, attempts to organize legal structures, attempts to protect government benefits while creating income systems, attempts to prevent outside manipulation. Eric says the audience saw isolated moments from that period but never understood how chaotic everything behind the scenes actually became. Because while people online debated motives and personalities, Eric claims he was moving nonstop trying to keep the entire situation from collapsing completely, driving people to appointments, meeting accountants, consulting attorneys, trying to structure trusts, trying to protect medical benefits, trying to create separation between money and vulnerable adults, trying to prevent exploitation from people surrounding the family. And according to Eric, one of the cruelest parts of the entire experience was realizing how quickly suspicion grows around anyone who becomes closely involved with vulnerable people online. Because eventually, every action becomes interpreted through suspicion. If you help, people ask why. If money exists, people ask where it went. If you stay involved, people question motives. If you leave, People accuse you of abandoning them. And Eric says somewhere inside all of that, the original goal got buried. Helping the family. That is the contradiction sitting at the center of this entire story. Eric insists he genuinely cared about the Whittakers. Many critics insist the internet attention surrounding them became exploitative no matter the intention. And the uncomfortable truth may be that both things can exist at the same time. Because the internet changes people. Attention changes relationships. Money changes trust. Fame destabilizes vulnerable environments. And once cameras become attached to suffering, motives become almost impossible for audiences to untangle cleanly. That is why this story never settled into a simple villain versus hero narrative. Too many contradictions exist. Too many emotional loyalties collided. Too many systems failed simultaneously. And according to Eric Carroll, the public still has not fully understood just how unstable things behind the scenes had already become before everything exploded into public controversy. Because the moment the protective orders entered the story, the situation stopped being private family dysfunction. Now institutions were involved. Now legal systems were involved. Now the internet was watching every move. And according to Eric, that is when the pressure inside the Whittaker story became almost impossible to control anymore. Comment below what you think was the real turning point in the Whittaker story. Was it the internet attention itself? The money? The family conflict? Or the moment outside systems finally got involved? Once adult protective services entered the Whittaker story, everything changed shape. That is one of the clearest themes running through Eric Carroll's explanation of what happened behind the scenes. According to him, the situation stopped being a loose network of creators, helpers, family members, and internet attention. Now it became something official, structured, documented, monitored. And Eric says many people still do not understand how serious that moment really was. Because viewers online often imagine APS as something that appears suddenly, removes people, and disappears. But Eric describes something far more layered than that. Meetings, questions, assessments, documentation, discussions about guardianship, medical vulnerability, financial responsibility, and long-term care. According to Eric, once APS became involved, the focus shifted away from internet narratives and toward one central issue. Could the Whittaker household safely support the vulnerable adults living inside it? That question changed everything, because now every problem people had ignored for years suddenly mattered all at once. The condition of the house mattered. Medical access mattered. Hygiene mattered. Financial accountability mattered. Medication routines mattered. Emotional stability mattered. Potential manipulation mattered. Even the simplest details started becoming part of a larger evaluation. And Eric says the hardest part was realizing how quickly decades of informal family survival could collapse once formal systems began measuring it against institutional standards. That is an important distinction. For years, the Whittakers had survived through family improvisation. Nobody was operating that household like a licensed K facility. There were no formal systems, no structured supervision, no professional oversight. People adapted to conditions slowly over decades until those conditions became normal to the people living inside them. But once APS became involved, normal no longer mattered. Now the question became whether the environment met standards of safety and care for vulnerable adults. And according to Eric, that was the moment the entire story became emotionally impossible for everyone involved. Because even people trying to help no longer fully controlled what would happen next. One of the biggest revelations Eric described was the guardianship paperwork. According to him, APS handed him information related to conservatorship and guardianship structures, financial oversight, legal authority, medical responsibility, care coordination. And Eric says people completely misunderstood what that moment meant. Critics online later pointed to that paperwork as evidence he wanted control over the family. But Eric insists the opposite was true. He says the folder represented responsibility, not opportunity. That distinction matters enormously in his version of events. Because according to Eric, viewers imagine guardianship as power. Control over money. Control over decisions. Control over people. But Eric says what he saw was burden. Massive legal burden. Medical burden. Financial burden. Emotional burden. And he insists he never wanted to suddenly become permanent legal caretaker for multiple vulnerable adults living several states away from his own family. That is why he repeatedly emphasizes that he already had a wife, children, responsibilities, and a life in Georgia. He says people online turn the situation into a fantasy version of control while ignoring what guardianship actually means in reality. Court supervision, medical obligations, financial documentation, liability, daily coordination, emergency responsibility. He says the internet treated it like ownership when in reality it was closer to lifelong accountability. And according to Eric, that misunderstanding became one of the biggest reasons public opinion turned so aggressively against him. Because once viewers started believing money and control were motivating factors, every action became interpreted through that lens. Suddenly driving people to appointments looked suspicious. Helping organize finances looked suspicious. Coordinating housing ideas looked suspicious. Meeting attorneys looked suspicious. Even trying to build structure around the family started being interpreted as manipulation. And Eric says by that point, it became nearly impossible to defend intentions publicly because the internet had already decided what story it preferred. That is another recurring idea in Eric's explanation. The internet chooses narratives emotionally long before evidence finishes developing. People decide who the villain is. Then they organize every detail afterward around supporting that conclusion. Eric says he watched that happen in real time. At first, many viewers praised him. They saw him cleaning the home, helping Timmy, taking family members to activities, trying to organize donations, improving hygiene routines, encouraging medical care. But once public opinion shifted, those same moments were suddenly reinterpreted completely differently. That emotional reversal became one of the defining features of the Whittaker controversy. And according to Eric, it affected the family themselves more than viewers realized. Because the Whittakers were not emotionally equipped to process internet warfare. Imagine strangers online debating whether people around you are helping or exploiting you while millions of viewers watch from a distance. Imagine family members hearing rumors they cannot fully understand. Imagine vulnerable adults trying to interpret accusations spreading across social media. Eric says confusion inside the household intensified dramatically once public controversy exploded. People began distrusting each other. Different creators offered competing narratives. Family members heard conflicting stories. Rumors spread faster than facts. And all of this unfolded inside an already fragile environment. That fragility is something Eric keeps returning to repeatedly. He argues the public underestimated just how emotionally unstable the household already was before internet attention arrived. Multiple generations living together under poverty, disabilities, isolation, health problems, long-standing family tensions, limited education, dependence on outsiders for transportation and resources. Then suddenly thousands of strangers begin watching every interaction online. According to Eric, the household simply was not equipped to survive that pressure intact. And once money entered the situation, everything intensified further. That is where the story becomes especially uncomfortable. Because Eric does not deny money became central to the chaos. He openly acknowledges that fundraising, monetization, donations, gifts, and public sympathy changed the environment around the family dramatically. But he argues people misunderstand how complicated the financial situation actually became. One of the most important points he raises is the issue of government benefits. According to Eric, vulnerable adults receiving disability or assistance programs cannot simply receive unlimited public donations without consequences. Large amounts of direct money can threaten benefits. Housing assistance can be affected. Medical eligibility can be affected. Income reporting becomes complicated. And Eric says many viewers online demanding just give them the money did not understand those systems at all. That is why he claims discussions about trusts, structured accounts, and organized financial systems became necessary. Not to hide money, to avoid unintentionally harming the family's eligibility for support programs. Whether people believe Eric completely or not, this part of the story reveals something important. The internet often imagines helping vulnerable people is simple when in reality it can become legally and financially complicated very quickly, especially once large audiences and large sums of money become involved. And according to Eric, the lack of clear structure around donations became one of the biggest dangers surrounding the family. Because once multiple creators, supporters, critics, and helpers entered the picture simultaneously, accountability became extremely difficult to track. Who promised what? Who collected what? Who paid for what? Who controlled which funds? Who made which agreements? The audience often assumes there was one organized system. Eric says there was not. Instead, there were overlapping relationships, informal arrangements, emotional promises, misunderstandings, online pressure, and constant public scrutiny all colliding at once. That kind of environment produces confusion naturally, and confusion creates suspicion, especially online. Eric also talks about something else that deeply affected him: the emotional attachment he developed towards certain members of the family, especially Timmy. That relationship became one of the most controversial parts of the entire Whittaker story. Critics accused creators of exploiting Timmy for content. Supporters argued Timmy appeared genuinely happier experiencing life outside the property. Eric insists people failed to understand how emotionally transformative those experiences were for someone who had lived such an isolated life. Restaurants, hotels, fishing trips, water activities, road trips, shopping, new environments, conversations with strangers. According to Eric, these experiences were not staged performances. He says Timmy's excitement was real, and that emotional reality complicated the public narrative enormously. Because critics saw Monet's content, supporters saw someone finally experiencing joy and stimulation outside lifelong isolation. Both sides looked at the same footage and interpreted it completely differently. That divide still exists today. And according to Eric, it may never fully disappear because people are arguing not only about facts but about morality itself. What counts as helping? What counts as exploiting? Can both happen simultaneously? Can someone genuinely care about vulnerable people while also benefiting from internet attention surrounding them? Those are uncomfortable questions, but they sit directly at the center of the Whittaker controversy. And Eric says the deeper he became involved, the more impossible simple answers started feeling. Because by the end, nobody inside the story trusted each other completely anymore. Not the audience, not the creators, not the family members, not even the systems trying to intervene. And once that level of distrust takes hold inside a vulnerable environment, collapse becomes almost impossible to stop. Comment below whether you think internet attention helped the Whittakers more than it harmed them, or whether the attention itself was always going to eventually tear the situation apart. By the time the state finally removed Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray from the home, the Whittaker story had already become much larger than any single creator, any single accusation, or any single moment online. That is the part Eric Carroll keeps returning to. He says people want one simple explanation because simple explanations feel emotionally satisfying. One villain, one betrayal, one moment where everything clearly went wrong. But according to Eric, the truth was far messier than that. Years of instability, years of neglect concerns, years of poverty, years of vulnerable adults surviving inside conditions most outsiders could barely imagine. Then suddenly the internet arrived and accelerated everything. Money accelerated things. Attention accelerated things. Conflict accelerated things. And eventually the systems that had remained distant for decades stepped directly into the middle of it all. Eric says when APS ultimately removed family members, many viewers immediately tried turning the event into proof of one specific theory. Some blamed creators entirely. Some blamed Betty and Larry entirely. Some blamed the state itself. Some blamed addiction inside the extended family. Others blamed the internet. But Eric argues the removal happened because too many warning signs had accumulated simultaneously. Not one issue. All of them together. Health concerns. Living conditions. Household instability. Conflicts inside the family. Questions about supervision. Questions about protection. Questions about who was actually capable of safely caring for vulnerable adults long term. And according to Eric, once state systems reached a certain threshold of concern, the process developed its own momentum. That momentum is important because Eric insists people misunderstand how little control any creator ultimately had once official intervention began. The audience often imagines creators directing events like producers directing a show. But Eric says the moment APES became deeply involved, decisions moved into institutional hands. Caseworkers, courts, evaluations, medical reviews, protective assessments, legal standards. At that point, the internet could scream all it wanted. The system would move according to documentation, not YouTube comments. And that realization changed how Eric saw everything afterward. Because according to him, the internet still treated the story like entertainment while real human consequences were unfolding behind the scenes. Families splitting apart. People losing daily contact with loved ones. Aging caregivers left alone. Vulnerable adults relocated into unfamiliar environments. Entire routines disappearing overnight. That is why Eric says one of the biggest misconceptions online is the idea that anyone won this situation. Because from his perspective, everybody lost something. Betty lost daily contact with people she helped raise. Larry lost the structure of the household he had known for decades. Timmy, Lorraine, and Ray lost the only environment they had ever fully understood, even if that environment had serious problems. And the public lost the illusion that internet attention automatically fixes suffering. That illusion may be the most important part of the entire Whittaker story. Because for a while, many viewers genuinely believed visibility itself would save the family. Millions of views, donations, trips, interviews, support, attention. People assumed all of that would naturally improve the situation permanently. But Eric says visibility without structure can become dangerous, especially around vulnerable people, because exposure attracts not only help, but chaos. Not only support, but opportunists. Not only empathy, but spectators. And eventually the family stopped being private people living in West Virginia and became symbols audiences projected their own emotions onto. Some viewers saw innocence. Some saw exploitation. Some saw poverty. Some saw internet corruption. Some saw addiction. Some saw systemic neglect. Everyone began using the Whittakers to argue about something larger than the family itself. And according to Eric, that pressure became unbearable, especially once public suspicion turned toward everyone involved. That suspicion still exists now. Questions about money still exist. Questions about motives still exist. Questions about accountability still exist. And Eric knows many people still do not trust him. He openly acknowledges that. But his central argument remains remarkably consistent. He says viewers never saw the full reality behind the scenes. They saw fragments, edited moments, partial timelines, pieces disconnected from the larger emotional and institutional collapse happening around the family. And whether people fully believe Eric or not, one thing is undeniably true. The Whittaker story stopped being just a family story a long time ago. It became a story about what happens when vulnerable people collide with internet fame before protective structures exist around them. It became a story about the limits of online empathy. A story about how quickly audiences turn suffering into spectacle. A story about how difficult it becomes to separate helping from benefiting once money and attention enter the picture. And maybe most importantly, it became a story about how systems often intervene only after damage has already become impossible to ignore. That is the tragedy sitting underneath everything. Not just who was right, not just who lied, not just who profited, but the reality that a family living in severe vulnerability became globally visible before stable protection ever truly arrived. And according to Eric Carroll, that is what people still fail to understand. The internet did not create every problem surrounding the Whittakers, but once the internet entered their world, every existing problem became larger, faster, louder, and far harder to contain. Now the family remains fragmented. Investigations continue. Questions remain unanswered, and public opinion remains deeply divided. Some people still believe Eric was trying to help. Others believe the entire situation became exploitation the moment cameras and monetization entered the picture. And honestly, that argument may never fully end. Because the Whittaker story sits directly in the uncomfortable space between compassion and spectacle, between assistance and exposure, between genuine care and internet consumption. That is why people still cannot stop talking about it. Not because it is simple, but because it forces people to confront questions the internet still does not know how to answer responsibly. Comment below what you think the Whittaker story will ultimately be remembered as: a story of help, exploitation, systemic failure, or something far more complicated than any single label can explain.